Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable. And the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr. Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
Hello and welcome to Dollars and Cents, the Australia Institute podcast where we're talking about just what the hell is going on in the economy. I'm Elinor Johnston-Leake, the senior content producer here at the Australia Institute, and as always, I'm talking to our chief economist, Greg Jericho. Hello, Greg.
Hello, Elinor.
How are we going today?
Really good.
Really good?
Excellent.
Does that have anything to do with what's in the news this week?
Partly.
Not all of the news. Okay, no, to be clear, not all of the news. Some of the news. Not
a very small part of the news, unfortunately.
Well, is that small part of the news potentially the December quarter inflation figures came out this week, and things are looking good. In fact, it's not just you that seems to be happy about it. A lot of people seem to be happy about it.
The soft landing that we have been planning for and preparing for is now looking more and more likely.
That is much better than was forecast, particularly forecast by the Reserve Bank.
Why is it important? It comes just a couple of weeks out from the RBA's first meeting of this year.
I'll leave the decisions on interest rates to the independent Reserve Bank. They can make that decision without kind of free advice or predictions from me.
We've seen the biggest collapse in Australian standard of living in our history, higher than any of our peer countries.
My job is to focus on our three goals, which is inflation down, wages up, unemployment low, and Australians together have made very encouraging progress on all three fronts.
Yeah, they were kind of the last figures that everyone was waiting to see to basically get that final box ticked for opening up the chances of an interest rate cut in 3 weeks' time. And as listeners will know, we've talked about sort of inflation even already this year. I think one of our first episodes back, we were talking about sort of the monthly figures that had come out for November showing, hey, inflation seems to be really down. And everyone's like, oh, yeah, that's the monthly figures. We've got to wait for the quarterly figures. They're the official ones. And they came out looking really good. The overall CPI, the inflation figure, dropped from 2.8% to 2.4%. Now, remember that the Reserve Bank's target is between 2 and 3%, so
bang
beautiful.
On. Yep.
And the underlying inflation measure, which I think actually gets a little bit too much attention, but which basically whenever you hear someone talk about underlying inflation, what they're basically saying is it's an inflation measure that uses exactly the same figures as the CPI, but they just cut out the top they top and tail the biggest drops and the biggest increases to kind of get sort of what's happening in the middle. And that fell from 3.6 to 3.2%.
Yep.
So again, that's
beautiful.
falling.
Yep.
So everyone's pretty confident that there's going to be a rate cut in 3 weeks' time. Before the figures came out on Wednesday, the market, which kind of you got all these investors, in a sense, betting what the rate will be in a month's time. There was about an 84% chance that they were thinking there's going to be a rate cut. After these figures came out, it increased to a 95% chance. So it's at the point,
good.
At the point if the Reserve Bank doesn't do it, everyone's going to be like, wait on, that was a bit wacky.
Yeah.
It's the Reserve Bank as a rule, and there's good things and bad things about this, but as a rule, they generally don't surprise the market too much. Because when they do that, the market sort of starts having hysterics. And also because these guys are all spending a lot of money, they're pretty well paid, they know what they're looking for, they know what's going to happen. So I think.
So what could possibly be stopping them from doing it now?
Oh, look, stubbornness, obstinacy.
Which you'd, of course, know nothing about.
No. Look, if they were not to do it, they would kind of have to explain why things they said in the past are no longer relevant. You know, they were sort of saying, we want to see a couple quarters in a row of CPI within the target range. Well, we've had that. They wanted to see underlying inflation coming down. Well, that's been happening steadily for well over a year. You know, it's sort of gone from 4 to 3.6 to 3.2. It's all headed where you'd want it. Wages growth has not gone up. And, you know, unemployment's still nice and relatively low at 4%, but it's, you know, it's been around that for ages. So it's like it really would take a hell of a lot of justification. They might say, we're worried about what's happening in America or international effects, but I just can't see it. I think it would be a really hard thing to justify.
Yeah.
Especially, and I should say this, because the figures came out, they don't just do the annual growth, they also do the quarterly growth. So what happened in the last 3 months of the year? Well, in the last 3 months of the year, prices on average rose 0.2%. That means basically on average they didn't go up. You know, on average, the amount of things that you were buying on average in the last 3 months of the year were not really any more expensive. It didn't cost you more than it did in July, August, and September. And if you can just sort of times 0.2 by 4 to get what would be the annual growth of that, it'd be 0.8%. Yeah, that's well below. So that if they weren't cutting them now, it's like, what are you really worried? You know, clearly prices are not rising, and that kind of would look, I think, a bit silly.
So what's been bringing inflation down recently?
Well, I mean, we've talked in the past about how the government's energy subsidy that they did at the last budget, that's been a big driver, and that continues to be the case. Drop in electricity prices is the biggest thing keeping inflation down. Now, some critics have been out there going, that means it's not real inflation, you know, the government's hiding. It's like, come on, guys. It's that kind of thinking that believes governments actually can't affect prices. Governments clearly can, because they have with this energy subsidy. And if you just assume that the governments can't do it, then all you're saying is the only thing we can do about inflation is to raise interest rates. And that's a terrible situation to be in, because it just is smashing people for no good reason.
How we got here.
Yeah. And look, you can say that electricity prices are the biggest cause of keeping inflation sort of lower than perhaps otherwise would be, but it'd be wrong to say that means that's all it is. 60% of the 87 items in what we call the CPI basket, so an item is bread, vegetables, fruit, car prices, education costs, and, you know, it gets pretty, you know, primary, secondary, tertiary, childcare, all these things. There's 87 sort of categories, and 60% of them had prices falling by less than 3%. Now, that's pretty damn good. Sort of an average for keeping it within the normal sort of target range of 2.5%. You'd see about maybe 70%. So they're really close to basically being, most things are not rising all that fast. So it really is a case that overall inflation's kind of gone as a problem. Now, that doesn't mean everything's fine and dandy. And, you know, we've had a lot of inflation over the last 2 years. And as I've said in the past, talking about inflation is always a bit sort of stupid for politicians, because when you say, inflation's come down, everyone's like, well, my prices haven't come down. And of course, remember, when we're talking about inflation, we're talking about the growth of prices. So in the 12 months to September, prices grew 2.8%. In the 12 months to December, they grew 2.4%. So we say inflation's come down, but the prices still went up 2.4%. And there's all that cumulative effect. So government is going to at least be happy that inflation seems to be under control, but they still got to deal with the fact that, hey, we've had 2.5 years of pretty strong price rises. Yeah,
and getting into the sort of politics of it, how would Albanese and Dutton respond if the RBA did cut interest rates? How would that affect, especially coming into the election, how would that affect things?
Yeah, it actually and this is why I go back to sort of why I think the Reserve Bank will do it, because I think if they didn't do it, it would seem very political. I mean, normally when we talk about the Reserve Bank doing things and trying not to look political, generally we're talking about them cutting rates or increasing rates, especially close to an election, because it's like, oh, if you increased rates, that'll look political, that'll hurt the government's chances.
It's saying that the economy is doing badly.
And things like that. Whereas at this point, if they did nothing, it's kind of like, you're making a political decision that is actually sort of countering the economics. So if they do cut, which I think they do, Albanese and the government will be extremely happy and there'll be huge sighs of relief. I don't think they'll rush to an election. I think if they were to sort of call an election straight away, that would look extremely cynical. And I think people are going to go, we're not going to reward you for one interest rate cut. I think they'd want to see that all flow through. People would actually get the reduction in their repayments, start to feel like things are better. Dutton is going to do what Dutton always does and, sort of whinge that, it's the government's fault that we didn't get cut sooner. It's small comfort for the millions of households that have been struggling under the government's mismanagement, all this blah, blah. He'll basically say, the Reserve Bank is finally sort of being able to overcome the government's mismanagement, which is complete tosh. And there's been a lot of economists, I won't say a lot, a few economists, especially those who like getting columns published in the Financial Review, who have been trying to push this notion that, government spending has been keeping inflation high. And it's like, no, actually, we can look at these figures that show that literal government spending on the energy subsidies has actually got prices down. It has worked exactly as it should. There's no evidence that there has been, government spending has been pushing up prices across the board or anything like that. So I think this is the thing I most like about these figures is it really highlights that governments actually can do something about inflation. We don't just have to sit around and go, I guess the interest rates have to go up. That's all we can do.
Something.
It's like, no. Especially if it's a case where prices are rising because of things got nothing to do with workers, got nothing to do with households. It's not like we're all getting massive wage rises. If you're getting massive wage rises, then you go, well, that's the cost of getting these massive wage rises. The price is probably going to go up, but we weren't getting that. So when that's happening, the absolute right thing for a government to do is come and go, you guys are getting smashed, especially with electricity prices and things that are no fault of yours. So we'll take care of you during this period because that's kind of what governments should do.
As we wait for a date for this year's federal election, the opposition's summer campaign blitz is starting to sound curiously familiar.
Jacinta Price will take additional responsibility. She will take on the important role of Shadow Minister for Government Efficiency.
An apparent nod to Donald Trump's appointment of Elon Musk as head of government efficiency in the US.
There is a lot of waste that's been generated over the course of the last 2.5 years, $6 billion a year spent on 36,000 new public servants in Canberra. That is of no assistance whatsoever to the people of Cairns.
Greg, we've talked a lot about Trump and his economic policies a few times on the pod. And obviously, as we've said, the news isn't entirely great at the moment. There's a lot going on at the moment in the US. We won't get into it here. If you want to know more about the US's sort of sudden descent into fascism that seems to be going on right before our eyes, you should probably go listen to our colleague, Dr. Emma Shortis, on her podcast, After America. It's very, very, very good. But what I would like to talk to you about today, Greg, is what a few of our politicians here in Australia seem to be doing. It seems to be straight up copying some of Donald Trump's policies. Peter Dutton has recently announced that Jacinta Nampijinpa Price will be the Shadow Minister for Government Efficiency, which looks a lot like Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency. Greg, what the hell is going on?
Yeah, there's not a lot of original thinking occurring. Not that it ever is the case on the conservative side of politics. And interestingly, it now means the Liberal Party actually have two shadow ministers
very efficient.
trying to crack down on government inefficiency. Yeah,
but the first one didn't have government efficiency in the name.
No, that's true. That's the key part.
Yeah.
Look, what we're seeing with Trump is, in a sense, the Project 2025 agenda, which is a very ideologically driven agenda by a bunch of kooky libertarians. Kooky is probably
it sounds a bit too nice.
Well, it's a redundant adjective when you're talking about libertarians, but essentially it involves a desire for government spending to be slashed and cut in any way possible so they can justify giving a massive tax cut to the very richest and to basically punish poor people. And that's essentially what we're seeing in America. A lot of public servants are being, there's an attempt to try and sack them. And we're seeing that here in Australia with Peter Dutton and the Liberal Party going on and on about, the government has employed 36,000 extra public servants since they've come on. 36,000, that's an outrageous thing. And it's like, well, one part of it is just the fact that Australia's population grows and you employ more people to do more services because there's more people to do it. But also one of the main reasons why the government has employed public servants is because the previous Liberal government sacked a lot of public servants, reduced the level of service, and more importantly, it's not like they were really saving money. What they were doing was in their final year, for example, of the Morrison government, the Morrison government spent $20 billion on consultants and outsourcing public service work. So it was still being done. It was just being done by people in the private sector who were charging more than public servants would. And because they were being consultants or it was outsourcing, they're not technically public servants. So the government could say, oh, look, we've cut back on public expenditure and all these public servants sitting around just doing nothing in offices.
Aren't we good at government efficiency?
And it's like, no, all you did was pay money to people who are charging more to do the same job, doing it less well because they're not concerned about public service. They're concerned about profit. And it also meant critical areas of government. For example, in Veterans Affairs under the previous government, there was a huge blowout in the backlog of claims from veterans for support and for, all manner of services and payments of money. Well, who actually deals with those claims? Public servants. You can cut back on. It's easy to cut back on public servants. You just, sack half the people working in Centrelink. Does that mean the people who need to go to Centrelink for services for claims, they're going to disappear? No, they'll still be there. It's just you got half the number of people doing the job, So, but even, and we're talking $20 billion, and that is a lot of money. I mean, it's about $4 billion more than government spends on JobSeeker. It's about $6 billion more than the government spends on childcare support. It's roughly the same amount that is spent on the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. It's a huge amount of money, but within the context of the entire budget and getting rid of government spending, it's actually small potatoes, really. It's so if you were to say, we're going to cut all these public servants, we're going to save $20 billion, it's like, oh, great. The total government expenditure was, $700 billion.
Yeah.
It's a real minute thing. When you hear about cutting government expenditure, what you really mean is we're going to cut back on funding of aged care, childcare, family support, JobSeeker, education.
Essential services.
Yeah. And that's because that's the big money. Yes, it might cost $20 billion to employ those public servants to do things, but the money that is being spent on the programs that they're administrating, that's where the actual real money is, and it's a case of if you really are talking about cutting back on government spending, what you're talking about is cutting back on essential services. But they don't want to say that. So they say, we're getting rid of these public servants who aren't doing anything.
Have they specified that they want to cut public servants again this time?
Yeah, that's the thing. They're going to, and they've pretty much set it at 36,000. We're going to get rid of all of them. It's like, okay, so you're promising to have a blowout in waiting times for payments to veterans, to people on single parenting payments, to people on disability support pensions. Is that really what you're doing? And their justification for it is getting quite absurd. This week, Peter Dutton was over in Perth and was talking about it. He's going, of these 36,000 public servants, have they made it less complex for you when you're applying for a bank loan at a bank? And I'm like,
What?
What? I don't think Westpac has employed the public. If you've got a problem with the complexity of banks and their home loans, well, you can actually change the regulations around what standards need to be kept in the banks, and the banks can sort of deal with it. It's like, but it's this thing of linking, these public servants and saying, oh, has that made, the price of bread cheaper? And it's like, no, but it might have actually improved the wait times on people ringing up Centrelink or, and so it always becomes this real false economy where they'll put off spending on things, say, oh, look, we've seen this time and time again over the last 30 odd years where, especially on government institutions, buildings and things like that, they go, oh, we're going to cut back. We need government efficiencies, and suddenly roofs start leaking in cultural institutions and all that, and then you find out actually the cost of repairing it is much more than it would have been if we'd actually dealt with the little leak in the first place. It's that type of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, just another thing in the news recently that seems to be directly importing the US's culture war bullshit. Queensland has recently banned puberty blockers for people under the age of 18, which seems ripped directly from, Project 2025.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with this is the shit goes both ways. I mean, this is coming not only from America, but from also the UK, Turf Island, as we call it. But, we export a lot of crap as well. We saw this week as well that Donald Trump's going to put quote unquote illegal immigrants in detention centers on Guantanamo Bay.
We have 30,000 beds in Guantanamo to detain the worst criminal illegal aliens threatening the American people. Some of them are so bad we don't even trust the countries to hold them because we don't want them coming back, so we're going to send them out to Guantanamo. This will double our capacity immediately, right? And that's a tough place to get out of. Which for anyone living in Australia over the past 30 years will sound very similar to certain things we do in Nauru and Manus Island.
So yeah, it's a circular economy of crap. But yeah, the Queensland government, and we also saw this week as well, an open letter calling for basically a review into gender affirming care after the next election. It's all pretty gross. It's straight out, flat out bigotry. It's always hidden as though, oh no, this is about protecting women. No, most of these people don't give a damn about women. They certainly don't give a damn about women's sport, which is often again used as a fig leaf. They pretty much, as we saw in the last Olympics, they only care about women's sport if they can spot someone who they think doesn't look feminine enough, and they will try and destroy an Algerian boxer's life because she looks masculine. Looks masculine, which wow, she's actually a cisgender woman who's doing a hell of a lot of weights and everything. Yeah, maybe she's not going to look as feminine as you want while punching someone in the face. That's it's not something that anyone looks particularly nice what they're doing. But, it's always this, you got to adhere to these certain standards of femininity. And then at the same time, they'll also criticize trans women for, you're trying to be a stereotypical woman. You're doing too much. Yeah, you're doing, they never can win. This move to ban puberty blockers and suggesting, it's just for people under the 18. Well, it's to protect the children. It's to protect the children. The whole reason for it is not because there is some mad ideological thing that people, we want boys to become girls or anything. It's actually that this is care for people. Trans teens are at extremely high risk of suicide, much more than all other teens, and high levels of depression and anxiety. And puberty blockers helps prevent that. I would have thought preventing teen suicide is a good thing. Clearly not. Yeah, and I mean, puberty blockers are also not
just used for trans teens as well. They have uses for cisgender teens as well.
Absolutely. And this is the whole thing is, and we've seen this in America as well this week with the notional attempts to basically ban trans people from armed forces, from various things, is that it very quickly bleeds into a whole lot of other programs that are being cancelled purely because they will have in there the fact that they're also trying to assist trans men and women. And it's like, oh, you're trying to assist trans men and women. Yeah, but also people of minorities, cis women, cis men with difficulties, with anxiety. Oh, yeah, but it was trans. Sorry, all cut. And very, very quickly, it apes essentially what we saw in the 60s and 70s, targeting gay men and women, trying to ban them from being able to be teachers, being in the armed forces, all these things. They just are being repeated with trans people. But the worst thing about it is, I think a bit more than we saw in the 60s and 70s against homosexuals was it's really going after kids.
Yeah.
Really targeting kids. And that's a really bad thing. And we're talking such small numbers. Maybe unfortunately the numbers are a bit unclear, but we're talking maybe 1.5% of all kids, all sort of people, kids of school age, and about maybe a quarter of that 1.5% are possibly using puberty blockers, and the process to go through, it's not like you can just rock up to the chemist.
Yeah.
There are a lot of steps, and actually part of the problem is it's really hard to actually go through that whole process. They're not covered by PBS, so it's really expensive. It's something that you're not doing lightly. It's something that you have to have cleared a lot of hurdles to get to.
You need the support of your parents.
Yeah. This is, and it very then quickly becomes also lies about gender reassignment surgery and all this. It's like, again, that's not happening to teens. That's,
no.
And it's certainly not some 13-year-old going, I want a hysterectomy or something because I think I'm a boy. There is so much lies about this, so much bad faith arguments. And I'm sorry, it's just bigotry. We've seen all this stuff that one of the big problems, it's very easy for us looking at America and going, oh, God, poor Americans having to deal with Trump. We're seeing very much an emboldenedness coming from conservatives and those in the far right here of seeing what's happening there and thinking.
Homegrown, true blue bigotry.
Yeah. And it's not a case of they're getting new ideas. They've had these ideas before, but they're saying, oh, Trump's doing it, so that makes it okay for us to talk about these things, which in the past people would look at you going, hang on, that seems a bit like a thing a Nazi would say, and now it's like, well hey, what's
Elon Musk doing up on that
what's
stage?
Wrong with being a Nazi? We're almost at that point. And it's very scary, and it applies not just to economics, with I'm sure we'll start hearing talk about tariffs and, all these other things that governments can do, and we need to, man up and all this. And so it's a case of that's why we do care about what's happening in America and the UK, because it's amazing how that sharing of shit ideas flows both ways.
Yeah. Well, hopefully on the podcast we can continue to provide some, haven of sensible approach to these things, I suppose.
A haven from the shit ideas.
But,
and also pushing back on them. But we shouldn't forget that actually this has been a good podcast because we might be getting a rate cut in 3 months.
Let's just think about that, I
3
guess.
weeks. It'll feel like 3 months, given the Reserve Bank has decided to take 2 months off holiday. Normally they'd actually be back next week, and which would be really good because we'd be back next week and we could be talking about a rate cut. But
we'll find something else to talk about.
We'll be back next week. It won't be talking about a rate cut because the Reserve Bank's still on holiday, but I'm sure there will be lots to talk about as we hit into February and the first sitting week. So that will be very exciting to see what the government has got planned. Thank you all for listening. My column, which has got all of the graphs and all of the data about what was going on with the inflation figures, can be found on the Guardian Australia site. For more research on why the Reserve Bank should have already cut interest rates and all other things going on with economics and also what's happening over in America, you can find on our website, which is at australiainstitute.org.au. My Blue Sky handle and the handle I use at other social media sites is at Grog's Gamut, and Elinor is at Elinor Johnston Leak.
Sure is.
Sure is. I'm never going to get that wrong because it's just your name. It's really,
It's a lot easier now on Blue
It's
Sky.
a lot easier. Our music, as always, is by Blue Dot Sessions. Please leave comments, feedback, 5-star reviews if you so desire. If you want to ask us a question, hit us up at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. Other than that, have a great week. We'll see you all next week. See you later.
See ya.